The 12 apostles, also referred to as the 12 disciples or simply the 12, were Jesus Christ's 12 closest followers. Each of them were major leaders in the movement which became Christianity and helped spread the gospel throughout the world. The names of Jesus' 12 main disciples are Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James, Jude, Simon, and Judas. Much of what we know about the apostles comes from church tradition. Unfortunately, tradition often embraces legends alongside facts, and it can be difficult to discern details about where the disciples went, what they did, and how they died without assuming that the legends surrounding them are completely rooted in truth. This is especially true for the more obscure disciples. Most historians agree, however, that all of the apostles listed died in ways that were less than pleasant. Let's explore them. Peter was one of Jesus' three main disciples. Like many of the apostles, Peter was a fisherman by trade, but he grew into one of the most prominent leaders of the early church after the resurrection of Jesus. According to Catholic tradition, he was also the first pope. Peter was originally known as Simon, but Jesus gave him the nickname Cephas in John 1:42, which translates to Peter, meaning rock. In the New Testament, Peter is most known for walking on water, disowning Jesus to avoid persecution, addressing the crowd at Pentecost, envisioning a church that included Jews and Gentiles together, and being a pillar of the church. As one of the three main disciples who was closest to Jesus, Peter got to witness miracles and moments that the other apostles weren't privy to, including the time Jesus raised a girl from the dead, the transfiguration, and Jesus' moment of weakness in the Garden of Gethsemane. But how did Peter die? According to tradition, Peter was crucified by Emperor Nero around 64 AD, around the time of the Great Fire of Rome, which Nero blamed on the Christians. The Acts of Peter claims that he asked to be crucified upside down because he didn't believe that he was worthy of dying the same death as Jesus. James is another one of Jesus' three main disciples, along with his brother John and Peter. Like many of the disciples, James was a fisherman before Jesus called to him. In the Bible, James, son of Zebedee, is most known for asking Jesus if he and John should call down fire from heaven to destroy a village which failed to show them hospitality, asking Jesus if he and John can sit on either side of Jesus' throne in heaven, and unwittingly promising to follow Jesus into martyrdom, and being martyred by Herod in Acts 12:2. So how exactly did James die? James is the only disciple whose martyrdom is recorded in the Bible, founded in Acts 12:2. Herod had him killed by sword, and he was likely beheaded. Judas Iscariot's death is also recorded as well, but it was under very different circumstances. Camino de Santiago refers to tradition which claims that James, son of Zebedee, was a missionary to Spain and that his body was buried there. But since his death took place in Jerusalem very early on in the history of the church, there are numerous challenges with this tradition. Nonetheless, the Camino de Santiago, a pilgrimage to the church where James is allegedly buried, was one of the most popular Christian pilgrimages for centuries, and Santiago de Compostela, the shrine that is dedicated to St. James, is still a destination for more than 300,000 people every year. John, son of Zebedee, not to be confused with John the Baptist, was the third disciple considered to be part of Jesus' inner circle with his brother James and Peter. Like James and Peter and several other disciples, John was a fisherman before following Jesus. In the Bible, John is most known for asking Jesus if he and James should call down a fire from heaven to destroy a village which failed to show them hospitality, asking Jesus if he and James can sit on either side of Jesus' throne in heaven, and unwittingly promising to follow Jesus into martyrdom, taking care of Jesus' mother, Mary, beating Peter in a race to Jesus' empty tomb, and being a pillar of the church. But how exactly did John die? According to tradition, John died of old age, which was a rare and possibly unique feat among the apostles, most of whom could not say the same for themselves. Tradition holds that he preached in Ephesus before being exiled to the island of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation. He returned to Ephesus afterwards and died of old age there sometime after 98 AD. Andrew was another apostle and follower of Jesus. Like his brother, he was a fisherman. According to the Gospel of John, Andrew was the first disciple Jesus called to, and while Peter gets all the credit for recognizing Jesus as the Messiah, Andrew not only brought Peter to Jesus, but he told him that Jesus was the Messiah. Before he was called by Jesus Christ, Andrew was actually a disciple of Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. How did Andrew die? Tradition claims that Andrew was crucified in the Greek city of Patras around 60 AD, and that, like Peter, he didn't consider himself worthy of dying the same way as Jesus. Instead, he was bound to an X-shaped cross, which became a symbol known as St. Andrew's Cross. According to the Acts of Andrew, he hung there for 3 days, preaching the entire time. Philip the Apostle is only mentioned 8 times in the New Testament, 4 of which are the lists of the apostles. However, there are 3 other people named Philip in the New Testament as well. 2 are sons of King Herod, and the other is Philip the Evangelist, who was often mistaken for Philip the Apostle even early on. How did Philip die? Philip likely died in the 1st century, possibly around 80 AD, but traditions vary widely as to how he died, at least partially due to the confusion with Philip the Evangelist. One tradition says that he died of natural causes, but others suggest that he was stoned to death, beheaded, or crucified upside down. The earliest accounts come from the Acts of Philip, which contains legends about Philip's ministry. According to the text, he was crucified upside down with Bartholomew. Philip preached to the crowd while hanging on the cross, and they wanted to release the 2 disciples, but Philip told them to free Bartholomew and leave him hanging there. Judas Iscariot is one of the most widely known disciples. He infamously betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, which led to Jesus' death on the cross. Today, Judas is virtually synonymous with traitor. Judas appears in several New Testament stories, and while the Gospel writers are in unanimous agreement that he betrayed Jesus, they present various takes on his motives and the circumstances surrounding his death. Each of the Gospels gives a slightly different version of the moment that Judas betrayed Jesus, but the main thread goes like this. Judas meets with the chief priests and agrees to betray Jesus. Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, and the disciples keep falling asleep. Judas arrives with an armed mob sent from the chief priests and points out Jesus by greeting him with a kiss. Shortly after, Judas regrets betraying Jesus, tries and fails to return the money the chief priests gave him. How exactly did Judas Iscariot die? Judas Iscariot's death was unique among the disciples. While James, son of Zebedee, was the only apostle to be martyred in the Bible, Judas Iscariot was the first to die. His death is also one of the go-to gotchas when people talk about contradictions in the Bible. The Gospel of Matthew says he hung himself. So Judas threw away the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. Matthew 27:5. The chief priests then used the money to buy a potter's field, presumably the field Judas hung himself in, because it was blood money, so they couldn't put it in the treasury. But Luke seems to record a different death for Judas in Acts 1:18 through 19. With the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong. His body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, so they called the field that he died in Akeldama, that is, field of blood. Some people make a point of trying to reconcile these two accounts, suggesting that Judas hung himself and then the rope broke, or that he remained hanging there for so long that his body decomposed and exploded. But that still doesn't solve the problem of one account saying that the priests bought the field after Judas died, and that others said that Judas bought the field before he died. It could also be that one of the writers goofed a detail. It could also be that the circumstances were so convoluted that both writers were in fact correct. But consider this, both accounts were written decades after Judas's death. Neither Matthew nor Luke were present for Judas's deal with Jesus' enemies. Since Judas was dead, much of the information would have come from the people who made the deal to kill Jesus. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised that the details are somewhat blurry. Matthew, also known as Levi, was a tax collector, one of the most reviled professions in first century Judaism. Despite the fact that Matthew is one of the better-known disciples, he's actually only mentioned 7 times in the Bible. Here are some accounts derived directly from the Bible. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Upon hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." The Pharisees see Jesus hanging out with the worst of the worst in their estimation, and assume that this is a reflection of his character, and it is, just not the way that they thought. Jesus wasn't eating with tax collectors and sinners because he was a sinner too. He was eating with them to demonstrate God's mercy and to mend the brokenness that came with being treated like religious outsiders. By including Matthew among his disciples, Jesus showed that no one, not even those in society who are considered irredeemable, would be excluded from God's table. Contrary to popular belief, the author of the book of Matthew is still anonymous, but Matthew the apostle is traditionally considered to be that author. The early church claimed that he wrote it, and the attribution, according to Matthew, was added possibly as early as the 2nd century. While there are no credible arguments against his authorship, no alternative writer has been named. How did Matthew die? Traditions disagree on how and where Matthew died exactly. Various accounts say that he was beheaded, stoned, burned, or stabbed. One even suggests that he died of old age, like John. Most scholars believe, though, that he was probably martyred. Thomas, perhaps better known as Doubting Thomas, famously doubted the resurrection of Jesus and told the other disciples, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Jesus then appeared and offered to let him do just that. After seeing Jesus in the flesh with his own eyes, Thomas proclaimed, "My Lord and my God." Jesus responded with one of the most powerful and prophetic statements about faith in all of Scripture. "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." Thomas's moment of skepticism earned him his nickname, Doubting Thomas, which evolved into a term for anyone who needs proof before they believe something. Honestly, that's all you really need to know about the Apostle Thomas. He's not a major biblical character by any means. He's only mentioned 8 times in the entire New Testament, and 4 of those times are just lists of the 12 apostles. And while throughout the church history people have been happy to fill in all the details of his life, few of those details are reliable. One other thing that you should know about Thomas is the Bible didn't give him a real name. Thomas wasn't actually given a name in the original manuscripts of the Gospel. Thomas comes from the Aramaic word for twin. To help clarify who we're talking about, though, most manuscripts include the description called Didymus, or called the twin. Didymus is a Greek word which means the twin. So a literal translation for John 11:16, John 20:24, and John 21:2 would say the twin called the twin, but you can still refer to him as Thomas. And how did Thomas die? For such a minor apostle, church tradition is remarkably consistent about his death. An early church calendar reads, 3rd of July, St. Thomas, who was pierced with a lance in India. Syrian Christian tradition specifies that this took place on July 3rd, 72 AD, and the Acts of Thomas says that he was martyred via spears in India. No other tradition exists about Thomas's death. James, son of Alphaeus, is only mentioned in the 4 lists of the apostles, so all we can really say for sure about him is that he had a really common name and that he was the son of someone named Alphaeus. Pretty much everything else we know about him comes from speculation, and there are a number of details that can't be proven one way or another. But how did James, son of Alphaeus, die? Since the early church often assumed James, son of Alphaeus, was the same person as Jesus' brother, James and James the Less, the details of his death and ministry are impossible to separate from the other Jameses. Traditionally, James the Just, or Jesus' brother, was shoved from the pinnacle of a temple, beaten with a fuller's club, and then stoned to death. Another tradition says that James, son of Alphaeus, was crucified in Egypt, where he was preaching at the time. Another just says that he was stoned to death in Jerusalem. However he died, odds are pretty good that he was martyred. Bartholomew is one of the most obscure apostles. His name only appears in the 4 lists of Jesus' 12 main disciples, and he's never listed with any titles or descriptions. All we really know is his name, and that he's closely associated with Philip. How did Bartholomew die? Like most of the apostles, Bartholomew was probably martyred, but there are several explanations of his death. The most popular is also the most gruesome. Bartholomew was allegedly flayed alive and then beheaded. Most art that portrays the apostles includes some iconography related to their death, and so Bartholomew is often portrayed wearing his skin, or in the less grotesque portraits, holding a filleting knife. Other accounts suggest that he was beaten and then crucified, crucified upside down, crucified and taken down before he died, then filleted and beheaded, just beheaded, or beaten unconscious and tossed in the sea to drown. No one claims he died of old age or natural causes, however. Jude the Apostle is also known as Jude of James, Judas of James, Thaddeus, Judas Thaddeus, and Lebbaeus. Some identify him with Jesus' brother, Jude, the traditional author of the Epistle of Jude, but the Bible doesn't tell us these Judes are the same person. In 2 of these lists of apostles, Jude appears to be referred to as Thaddeus. Since these 2 names appear in about the same place in the lists, and the other names are consistent, church tradition has always assumed that Thaddeus was a nickname for Jude of James. Since the name Judas has such a strong negative association in the early church, it wouldn't be surprising if Jude preferred to go by another name, or if Matthew and Mark used the nickname to avoid confusion. Most traditions assume Jude the Apostle wrote the Epistle of Jude because they assume he's the same person as Jesus' brother, Jude. But unfortunately, Jude was a super common name, and this relies on assumptions. Today's scholars have mixed opinions on Jude's authorship. But according to tradition, St. Jude suffered martyrdom at about 65 AD in Beirut, in the Roman province of Syria during the 1st century in Lebanon, together with the apostle Simon the Zealot, with whom he is usually connected. The axe that he is often shown holding is symbolic for the way in which he possibly died. Simon the Zealot is only mentioned by name in lists of the apostles, so we know almost nothing about him. Even his moniker, the Zealot, is ambiguous enough that we can't be sure what it means, though there are several strong possibilities. Simon the Zealot may have belonged to a Jewish sect known as the Zealots, who were bent on revolution and looking for a Messiah to violently overthrow Rome. The Bible doesn't tell us what the Zealot signified, so no one can say for sure. Simon the Zealot is mentioned occasionally in early church writings, but centuries after the Gospels were written, Jerome and others mistranslated Simon's title, believing that Matthew and Mark referred to him as Simon the Canaanite or Simon the Cananian. They assumed that he was from Cana, which was a town within Galilee, or possibly even descended from one of the non-Jewish groups in the area. This mistake led to the idea that Simon was present at the wedding in Cana in John 2, where Jesus performed his first miracle and turned water into wine, and that he was the same person as Simon, the brother of Jesus, founded in Matthew 13:55. Some Bible translations preserve Jerome's mistake out of respect for tradition, calling Simon the Canaanite or the Cananian in Matthew 10:3 and Mark 3:18. While the Bible doesn't tell us anything more about Simon of Zealot, a later tradition claims that he preached in Egypt, then partnered with Judas, the brother of Jesus. Judas preached first in Mesopotamia and in Pontus, and Simon preached in Egypt, and from thence came they into Persia, and found Zeros and Arphaxad, whom St. Matthew had driven out of Ethiopia. How did Simon of Zealot die? There are numerous accounts of Simon the Zealot's death, but the earliest records come from centuries after his death. Like many of the apostles, it's hard to conclude exactly which tradition, if any, can be trusted. In the 5th century, Moses of Chorene wrote that Simon the Zealot was martyred in the kingdom of Iberia. The Golden Legend says that he was martyred in Persia in 65 AD. Ethiopian Christians believe he was crucified in Samaria. Another account says that he was crucified in 61 AD in Britain. In the 16th century, Justus Lipsius claimed that he was sawed in half. Eastern traditions claim that he died of old age in Edessa. So maybe he was a martyr, and maybe not. Matthias the Apostle is technically also one of the 12, but usually not included in lists for a couple of reasons. One, he was appointed after the death of Judas Iscariot, and secondly, he wasn't called into the group by Jesus. He was appointed by the apostles to replace Judas Iscariot. Several of the disciples are pretty obscure, but Matthias takes the cake. He's only mentioned 2 times in the entire Bible, first in Acts 1:23 and second in Acts 1:26. All we really know about Matthias from Scripture is that he met Peter's requirements for selecting a new member of the 12. He agreed he'd follow Jesus since his baptism by John the Baptist, and he witnessed Jesus' ascension to heaven. One of the biggest questions surrounding Matthias is whether or not God intended for him to replace Judas Iscariot. Some argue that this appointment was more of the result of Peter's restlessness than God's plan, especially since Paul was personally called by Jesus to be an apostle later. To choose someone to replace Judas, about 120 believers nominated 2 people, and then they cast lots. Scholars can't say for sure what was meant by casting lots here. It could have just meant voting, drawing a name from a jar, or something else, but the principle of casting lots goes back to the Old Testament. It was a process the Israelites used to discern God's will, seek His wisdom, and learn the truth. Before they cast lots in Act 1, the disciples pray, "Lord, you know everyone's heart. Show us which of these 2 you have chosen to take over this apostolistic ministry, which Judas left to go where he belongs." Their intent was clearly to learn God's will, but the problem here is that everything leading up to that moment appears to have been Peter's will. Peter assumed it was their duty to select someone to replace Judas, but that doesn't mean that it was, and the fact that God chose Matthias when given the choice between Matthias and Joseph doesn't mean that the entire process was God's will. So was Matthias supposed to be one of the 12? Maybe, but regardless, he was one of the 12 in the end, and God used him. As one of the 12, Matthias played a key role in helping spread the gospel and led the church when it was at its most fragile. After receiving the Holy Spirit with the other apostles on the day of Pentecost, he left to preach the gospel in Judea, where he was later crucified.